sold at 41 as past bearing. A widowed sheriff held their firstborn a year later. The ink on the sale document was still wet when Hattie Pruitt arrived in Garnet Creek on the Thursday stage. I know because I was the one who signed it. Not her sale, that's not what I mean. I signed the bill of lading for 3 crates of dry goods that came in on the same coach, and I was still standing at Connolly's freight dock when the stage rolled to a stop, and a woman climbed down with one trunk, a carpetbag the color of old saddle leather, and an expression that told the whole street to go straight to hell if it planned on staring. I wasn't staring. I was just there. But she looked at me anyway, the way you look at a man who's wearing a badge, checking what kind of trouble he might be, or what kind of help. I touched my hat. She didn't nod back, just picked up her own trunk, didn't wait for the driver, didn't ask, and walked toward the hotel. That was October. I didn't speak to her until November. My name is Cord Halsey. I was 44 years old that fall, and I had been the sheriff of Garnet Creek for going on 6 years, which in that country was long enough to feel like a century. My wife, Louise, had died of a fever 3 years prior. We'd had no children. The town knew this the way small towns know everything, not because anyone said it plainly, but because of the way certain women looked at me at church and certain men didn't look at me at all, embarrassed on my behalf for reasons I hadn't asked them to carry. I was not broken. I want to be clear about that. I was just quieter than I used to be, and careful. I'd gotten careful the way a man gets careful around a fire after he's been burned once, not afraid of it, just respectful of what it can do. The town of Garnet Creek had about 400 souls, a decent mercantile, a passable livery, a church that was too cold in winter, and a saloon that was too warm year-round. I had a small house on the north edge of town and an office next to the Assiers. I did my job. I ate supper alone most nights. I read when the lamp held out. That was my life, and I had made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with a scar. You don't love it, but you stop being surprised by it every morning. What I did not know, that October when the stage rolled in, was that the woman with the carpetbag had come to Garnet Creek because she had nowhere else to go. Her name was Harriet Pruitt, Hattie to everyone who knew her. She was 41 years old, a widow out of the Cheyenne country, and she had been sold. I don't use that word lightly, but that's what had happened. Her husband, Martin Pruitt, had died the spring before. A horse roll, slow and bad, took 3 days to finish him. He'd left no will. His brother Delmer rode out from Nebraska inside of 2 weeks, assessed the property, and informed Hattie that the ranch would go to him by right of blood. She could stay on as hired help or she could leave. When she didn't agree fast enough, Delmer sold her off, that's the word he used, according to what I eventually heard, to a rancher named Fitch over in Powder River country. Sold her, meaning he arranged a marriage, meaning he took $200 and a horse for brokering a woman he considered to be of no further use to anyone, including herself. He told her to her face that she was past bearing. Past bearing. 41 years old, and a man had looked her in the eye and told her she was finished. She had not gone to Powder River. She had taken what was hers, the carpetbag, the trunk, $40 she'd sewn into the lining of a coat, and she had gotten on a stage going south and then west, and then wherever it stopped next, which turned out to be Garnet Creek. I learned all of this slowly, not from her. From the way things leak in a small town, a word here, half a sentence there, and eventually I pieced it together the way you piece together what happened at a fire from what's left standing. What I knew in November was simpler. I knew she had taken a room at the hotel for 2 weeks and then moved into the small house behind the laundresses on account of it being cheaper. I knew she had gone to see Doc Alderman about work and that he had nothing to offer. I knew she had gone to the school to ask about the teacher's position and been told it was filled. I knew she had taken in mending. I knew she walked every morning before the town was fully awake, out the north road toward the creek, and back again before 6. I knew this because I was often up before 6, had been for years, since Louise and I had seen her twice on that road, and both times we had done nothing but nod. The third time, I was carrying a dead rabbit I'd found in one of the traps I kept for the pot, and she was carrying a bucket she'd filled at the creek for her wash, and we were both going the same direction, and it seemed foolish not to walk together. She said, "That's a decent-sized rabbit." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You set traps up on the North Creek." I said, "Have for 2 years." She said, "There's a second run about 40 yards upstream. Bigger. You'd do better there." I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me, looking at the road. I said, "How do you know?" She said, "I was on a ranch for 14 years. I know where rabbits run." That was the whole conversation. But I moved the trap that afternoon and she was right. December came in cold. Ice on the water trough by the 7th, which was early even for that country. I had a situation with 2 drifters who decided the Hargrove homestead looked unattended. It wasn't. The Hargroves were just quiet, and I was gone 3 days sorting it out. When I came back, my stove had gone cold and the bread I'd left out had gone stiff, and there was a plate on my front step, covered with a cloth. Underneath the cloth, half a beef pie still faintly warm and a folded piece of paper that said in small handwriting, "Your fire will take a while. Eat first." I stood in the cold holding that plate for longer than I should have. She had walked past, seen the dark house, known I'd just gotten back and left that. No signature. She didn't need one. There were only 2 women in Garnet Creek who might have done it, and Mrs. Connolly was 70 years old and had never once been kind to me without a reason. I ate the pie at the cold table, and I thought about what a person has to have inside them to do a thing like that quietly, without wanting anything back. January was when I started watching for trouble. Not trouble with her, trouble for her. I'd heard more of the story by then. Word travels and Garnet Creek was no different. I knew about Delmer Prout and the $200 and what he'd said about her being past bearing, and I knew some of the men in town had filed it away the wrong way, not with anger on her behalf but with a kind of calculation. A woman alone, with no family, no strong attachment to the town. That's the kind of information that draws the wrong sort of attention. Fitch, the man in Powder River country she'd been sold to, sent a letter in January. I know because Carver at the post office mentioned it to me, trying to be helpful. I didn't ask to see it, but I started making a point of being visible on the street at the time she walked, not following her, just a present, available, in case. She noticed, of course she noticed. One morning in late January she stopped walking when she saw me and said, without preamble, "Are you watching me, Sheriff, or watching out for me?" I said, "Is there a difference?" She looked at me for a long moment, clear-eyed, steady. The cold had put color in her face and her breath showed in the air between us. She said, "There is, and I'd like to know which." I said, "Watching out for you. Fitch has been writing." Something moved across her face, not fear exactly. More like a woman who has been bracing for a hit, confirming it's coming. She said, "He has no claim." I said, "I know that." She said, "And Delmer's transaction was not legal." I said, "I know that too." She looked at the road for a moment, then back at me. She said, "Then I suppose I'll trust your judgment on it, for now." And she walked on. For now. I turned those 2 words over for a week. There was something in her that I recognized from the inside, a person who has learned to hold themselves very still because stillness is the only thing that's theirs. Louise had not been like that. Louise had been warm and easy and open as a summer morning. Hattie Prout was not like that, and the difference was not a flaw in her. It was the record of what had been done to her, written in the way she held herself, and I understood it in my bones in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to be careful themselves. I did not tell myself I was falling in love with her. I am not sure I knew the word for what was happening. It felt more like recognition. Like finding, in a country you thought you knew, a landmark you hadn't expected. Fitch came in person in February. He was a thick man, prosperous looking in the way of men who have gotten what they want often enough to wear it on the outside. He came with a hired man and a letter he claimed made some legal argument about the arrangement Delmer had brokered, and he went straight to the hotel, didn't come to my office first, which told me everything I needed to know about how he saw this. I let him get settled. I gave him until supper. Then I went to the hotel and asked the clerk which room, went upstairs and knocked. He opened the door and said, "Sheriff, I figured you'd come around." I said, "The woman you're here about is not for sale, was never for sale, and any document Delmer Prout gave you is not worth the paper it's on." He said, "Now I'm not looking for trouble." I said, "Good. Then you'll leave in the morning." He started to say something about money spent and a long ride and how a deal was a deal, and I let him talk for a while because I've found that men like that run out of words faster if you don't interrupt them. When he was done, I said, "If you're here past noon tomorrow, I'll have a conversation with the territorial judge about the nature of what you and Delmer Prout arranged. That conversation is likely to be more interesting for you than it is for me. Your choice." He left at first light. I know because I was up before 6 as usual. I didn't tell Hattie right away. I wasn't sure how to say it without it sounding like I expected something in return. But she knew he'd come. This was Garnet Creek. Someone had seen him arrive, and she found me the next morning at the freight dock, which was becoming a place we found each other without quite admitting we were looking. She said, "He's gone." I said, "He's gone." She was quiet for a moment. The river smell was on the cold air, and somewhere down the street the blacksmith had started early, the ring of it carrying clean and hard. She said, "What did it cost you?" I said, "Nothing, it was my job." She looked at me in that level way she had. She said, "Cord, what did it cost you?" And something in how she said my name, just my name, plain, like she'd been saying it her whole life, and would say it for the rest of it. Something in that cracked open a room I'd had shut for 3 years. I said, "Nothing I wasn't glad to spend." She didn't say anything, but she reached over and put her hand on my arm just for a moment, just her fingers through the wool of my coat, and that small pressure, that deliberate, quiet choosing, told me more than anything she could have said. Spring came and the creek ran high, and the town started moving again the way it does after a hard winter. Everybody out, everybody talking, the livery busy, the street loud with it. I asked her to walk with me one Sunday after church. She said, "We've been walking together since November." I said, "Not like this." She considered it. She said, "No, not like this." We walked out to the North Creek, past where I kept the traps, and she showed me the second run, the better one, 40 yards upstream, exactly where she'd said. We stood there for a while watching the water. I said, "I know what Delmer told you, about being past Bering." She didn't flinch. She said, "I know you know." I said, "He was wrong." She looked at the creek. She said, "You don't know that." I said, "I know it wasn't his to say, and I know the rest doesn't matter to me." She was quiet for a long time. The water ran over the rocks and a hawk went over high, and the light was the thin, clean kind that comes in early March when you're still not sure winter's really done. She said, "You're a careful man." I said, "I've learned to be." She said, "Me too." A pause. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." I said, "That's all right. I'm not asking you to." She turned and looked at me, really looked, the way she'd looked at me that first morning when she wanted to know if I was watching her or watching out for her. And whatever she saw, it seemed to be enough. She said, "All right, Cord, all right." We married in May. Small. Her in a dress she'd made herself from blue calico, me in my good coat with the buttons I'd finally had replaced. Doc Alderman and his wife stood up with us. The preacher kept it short because I'd asked him to. She moved into my house on the north end of town. We painted the porch rail. She put up curtains, plain white ones that moved in the summer wind. That first summer was, I don't have the right word for it. Not easy, not exactly. We were both people who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, and now we were learning to take up space together, which requires a different kind of care. But it was good, steady and good. She knew how to do things I didn't, the garden, the accounting for the house, certain knots. And I knew how to do things she'd had to do alone for too long, and we were useful to each other in the plain, solid way that I think is the real foundation of a life, if you're lucky. She was not past bearing. She was 3 months along by September. She figured it before I did. She had always been sharper at reading evidence, and she told me one morning at the table with the same directness she brought to everything, just set down her coffee cup and said, "I think you're going to be a father, Cord." I sat with that for a minute. Then I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am, are you?" I said, "Yes." She picked her cup back up. We finished breakfast. I went to work, but I sat at my desk that morning and I did not do much that was useful for about an hour because I was 45 years old and something I had given up on had come back, and I did not know what to do with that except sit with it and let it be real. The baby came in late April. I won't go into the details of it except to say it was long and hard, and there were hours in the middle of that night when I stood in the kitchen with Doc Alderman, and neither of us said much, because there was nothing to say. And then it was done, and she was all right, and the baby was all right, and Doc called me in. She was tired, the kind of tired that lives in every line of a person's face, but she was there, and she handed him to me, our son, red-faced and loud about his opinions already, and she watched me take him. She said, "Well." I said, "Well." She said quietly, "You're going to be good at this." I don't know why that's the thing that got me, of all the things. But she said it the way she said everything, plain, like it was already fact, like she'd looked at the evidence and drawn her conclusion, and I believed her. I stood there with that boy in my arms, all 6 pounds and some change of him, squirming and red in mine, and my wife watching me with those clear, steady eyes, and I thought about Delmer Prout telling her she was past bearing. I thought about a woman packing a carpetbag and $40 and getting on a stage to nowhere, because the only other choice was surrendering to a man who had no right to her. I thought about how much courage that takes, to go nowhere rather than the wrong place, to keep your own name in a world that's trying to hand it to someone else. She hadn't needed me to rescue her. She'd been doing fine on her own before I came along. What she'd needed, what we'd both needed, was a reason to stop being careful all the time, a person who made the carefulness unnecessary. That's what she was for me, and maybe if I'd done it right, that's what I'd been for her. The lamp was burning low. Outside, Garnet Creek was quiet in the way it only gets in the hour before the roosters start. Our son had gone still against my chest, exhausted by the work of arriving. I looked at her. She was already half asleep, one hand loose on the quilt. I said low, "Get some rest." She didn't open her eyes. She said, "Don't go far." I didn't. I sat down in the chair by the bed and held the boy and watched the lamp burn and listened to the two of them breathe. And I stayed right there until morning came.